where the smallest moments often carry the greatest weight. Let me ask you something. What would you do if a complete stranger knelt beside your child, a child who rarely speaks, who doesn't look anyone in the eye, and did something even you never dared to try? Sometimes, it's not the therapists, the experts, or even the parents who break through first. Sometimes, it's someone unexpected, someone who simply knows how to wait. If you believe that strangers can sometimes be the first to truly reach a child's heart, hit that like button, and subscribe, because these stories aren't fiction. They're happening, quietly, powerfully, all around us. Now let me tell you about one such moment that changed everything for a father named Daniel. It was a quiet Sunday morning at Lakeside Park, the kind of morning when families strolled hand in hand, joggers moved to the rhythm of birdsong, and the breeze off the water carried the scent of dew and new beginnings. But for Daniel Stone, the morning was not about beginnings. It was about routine. Predictable, quiet, isolating routine. He sat on the far end of a wooden bench under a maple tree just beginning to bloom, legs crossed, posture upright but tired. His silver-gray blazer, crisply tailored, contrasted with the casual joggers and families in shorts and sneakers. His face, unmistakable to anyone who followed the world of tech, was the kind seen in business magazines, on keynote stages, or next to phrases like "billion-dollar exit." But here in this park, he was just a man trying to keep control over the only thing he couldn't code, predict, or scale. Beside him sat his 7-year-old son Max. Max was small for his age. Pale, slight, and always clinging to the same faded plush pillow, a hand-sewn square of blue fleece with a frayed corner he rubbed whenever the world got too loud. His strawberry blonde hair was tousled, his knees tucked up on the bench as if retreating into himself. Max didn't speak. He rarely looked up. His eyes stayed locked to the ground, and even when other kids squealed by on scooters or threw breadcrumbs at the ducks, he remained still, a quiet figure in a loud world. Daniel glanced at him, as he did every few minutes. There was no conversation to be had, not even eye contact to share. Still he came here every Sunday, hoping something might change, a twitch of recognition, a moment of connection, a crack in the silence. None came. He had read every book, hired every therapist, spared no expense. But the truth which gnawed at him even as he fought to hide it, was that Max's silence terrified him. Not because it made him different, but because Daniel didn't know how to reach him. And Daniel Stone, architect of networks, creator of systems that powered millions of devices, had never once built a bridge that could reach his own son. That morning, he was particularly tired. Max had barely slept the night before. Something had upset him, and he'd been curled up under his blanket humming in short bursts until nearly 4 a.m. So Daniel let the sun soak in, let the breeze brush against his face, and sank a little into the back of the bench. He was just beginning to close his eyes when he heard footsteps on the gravel path. They were light, not hurried, not hesitant, but deliberate. When he opened his eyes, a woman was approaching. She was alone. Early 30s, perhaps. Blonde hair tied back in a low ponytail, gray wool sweater, a pair of worn jeans and boots speckled with dirt. She held a small paper box in her hand, something from the bakery down the street, Daniel guessed, judging by the faint whiff of cinnamon that drifted toward him. She didn't look at him. Her eyes were on Max. Daniel stiffened. Instinctively, his hand gripped the edge of the bench. He was used to people staring. Sometimes out of curiosity, sometimes pity. But approaching? This close? No one did that. She walked up to the bench, not all the way, but just enough to be within arm's reach. She lowered herself slowly, knees touching the grass, until she was eye level with Max. Daniel leaned forward, ready to intervene. But then, she did nothing. No greeting. No wave. No attempt to touch him. She simply sat there, quietly, on her knees, as if waiting for something only Max could offer. And then with the gentlest motion, she opened the box in her hand and pulled out a small cookie, round, golden, slightly cracked in the middle. She broke it in half. Slowly, carefully, she placed one half on the bench, just a few inches from Max's hand. The other half, she brought to her mouth, and took a bite. Still, she said nothing. Max didn't move. Daniel exhaled, unsure if he was watching something foolish or profound. For a moment, nothing happened. The woman stayed still. The park went on behind them. A dog barked. A bell from an ice cream truck rang faintly in the distance. Max didn't look at her. He didn't even blink. But then, as if drawn by something invisible, Max's hand shifted. He reached, slowly, tentatively, and picked up the half cookie. He didn't look at the woman. He didn't look at his father. He just brought it to his mouth and took a bite. Daniel felt his chest tighten. It was the first time Max had ever accepted anything from a stranger. No prompting. No therapy cue. No reward system. Just a silent exchange. And Daniel Stone, a man who had built empires from logic and code, sat stunned, undone by a single moment of human instinct between his silent son and a woman he had never seen before. Her name was Emily Parker. She had only moved to the town 2 weeks earlier, settling into a modest apartment on the east side of the lake, just a 10-minute walk from the park. Her life up to that point had been quiet, not in the way that Max was quiet, but in the way someone becomes after years of trying and failing to make too much noise in a world that rarely listened. She was 34. A former city schoolteacher with a soft voice and a long history of being underestimated. After a painful divorce and the sudden passing of her younger sister, whose son had been on the autism spectrum, Emily had walked away from everything familiar. The apartment. The school. The city skyline. She left it all behind, chasing stillness, or maybe just space to breathe. She had spent her mornings wandering, learning the rhythms of this slower place. The market. The docks. The old bookstore that smelled of cedar and forgotten pages. On Sundays, she allowed herself a cinnamon cookie from a nearby bakery, a small comfort, a ritual she had once shared with her nephew when he was still alive. It was that ritual, that cookie in her hand, that had led her to the bench by the lake. She hadn't meant to stop. She had just noticed the boy first, hunched, holding a pillow like it was oxygen. Then the man beside him, stiff as if bracing against life itself. Something about the boy's stillness, the weight of it, had stopped her mid-step. She didn't hesitate. She didn't calculate or question. She just walked toward them. She felt the man's eyes on her, sharp, wary. But she didn't look at him. Her gaze remained on the boy. There was a softness in his silence that called to her. It wasn't unfamiliar. She had seen it in her nephew's face when the world got too loud. She had seen it in the mirror during her loneliest days, that expression of someone still present, but receding beneath the surface. Emily knelt on the grass beside the bench. She didn't speak. She knew better. Words, she had learned, could sometimes be weapons, even when meant with kindness. For some children, for some people, silence was safer. She opened the box in her hands and pulled out a small cookie, still warm, the cinnamon aroma curling in the air between them. She broke it in half slowly, delicately, so he could see the motion. One half went to her mouth. She took a bite, chewed slowly, and then placed the other half gently on the wooden bench, just near his hand, without ever touching him. Then, she waited. She stayed still, her body loose, eyes soft but not searching, not demanding. She didn't expect a reaction. That wasn't the point. The point was to make space, for trust, for choice, for possibility. And maybe in that space, the boy would find something he hadn't been offered in a while, the power to decide, free from pressure. The seconds stretched long. She could hear the man shift behind her, a slight movement of his coat, maybe a clearing of the throat. He didn't interrupt. That alone told her something about him. He was protective, yes. But curious. And maybe desperate. She glanced, just once, at the boy's face. His gaze hadn't lifted, but his fingers had paused mid-rub on the pillow. His other hand twitched slightly at his side. Not a grab. Not a flinch. Just the smallest adjustment. And then slowly, almost imperceptibly, he moved. His hand reached out. It didn't tremble. It didn't hesitate. It simply crossed the distance between his body and the broken cookie beside him. He picked it up. Not with greed. Not with fear. With precision. He brought it to his mouth and took a small bite. Emily didn't smile. She didn't gasp. She didn't speak. She simply closed her eyes for a moment and breathed, not because she had succeeded, but because she had been allowed into that moment at all. Behind her the man, Daniel, was frozen. She could feel it. The way the air shifted. The breath he didn't take. She knew, even without turning, that she had witnessed something sacred. This boy, this silent child with oceans in his eyes, had chosen to respond. Chosen to accept. Not just a cookie, but her presence. Her offering. She knew what that meant. And yet, she didn't stay. She stood slowly, brushing her knees as she rose, careful not to disrupt whatever delicate balance had formed on that bench. Still without speaking, she glanced at the man now. A quick, respectful nod. Nothing more. Then she turned and walked away, the box still warm in her hands, though now one cookie short. As she left the park, she didn't expect to see them again. She didn't even know their names. But something about the boy's quiet, about that fragile connection, it followed her. Stayed with her long after the grass was gone from her jeans and the cinnamon scent had faded from her fingers. That day didn't change who Emily was. But it reminded her of something she had buried. That maybe, she still had something to offer. That maybe, she could still reach someone. That maybe, her quiet wasn't a weakness. Maybe, just maybe, it was a language all its own. Her name came later. Daniel had assumed she would disappear as quickly as she had appeared, that the moment on the bench had been a fluke, a curiosity, a fleeting ripple in the otherwise predictable stillness of his Sundays. But 3 days after that morning, he saw her again. This time, at the local library. He was standing in the children's section, flipping through a book he wasn't truly reading, while Max sat cross-legged on the carpet nearby, surrounded by picture books he had pulled off the shelf but hadn't opened. Daniel wasn't expecting company. He never did. Then he saw her. Same soft gray sweater. Same quiet presence. Only this time, she was crouched near a display table, not looking in their direction. But there was no mistaking her. She wasn't from here. She didn't carry herself like the others. No rushed movements, no forced small talk with the staff. She existed like background music, soft enough to be ignored, but once noticed, impossible to forget. Daniel felt a flicker of something he didn't recognize immediately. Was it suspicion? Curiosity? Hope? She looked up and caught his gaze. He braced himself, for a smile, a wave, perhaps some indication that she recognized him too. But she gave nothing away. Just a small nod, the kind one gives a stranger in passing, and returned her attention to the books. He wanted to approach her. To ask her something, what, he wasn't sure. How she knew what to do with Max. Why she did it. If she worked with special needs children? If she had been trained? Instead, he watched as she picked up a book, a slim volume with watercolor illustrations and no more than a dozen words per page. She held it gently, flipping through the first few spreads, then walked over to a nearby table and set it down. Daniel's eyes followed her, then shifted back to Max. The boy hadn't moved much. Still silent. Still hugging his pillow. Then, something remarkable happened. Max looked up. His eyes drifted toward the table, toward the book. And then he stood. No prompting. No coaxing. He walked over to the table, climbed into the seat across from her, and opened the book. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. She didn't speak to him. She didn't even look at him. She simply turned a page when he paused. Nothing more. 15 minutes passed that way. Daniel watched from behind a row of shelves, stunned. His son, whose entire world was built on routines, who recoiled from touch and avoided all eye contact, was sitting beside a stranger. Calm. Engaged. At ease. After a while, she stood up and walked away without a word. Max didn't protest. He closed the book, stood slowly, and returned to his father. Daniel couldn't hold his tongue this time. He approached the circulation desk, waited for her to check out a small stack of books, then stepped forward. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low. She turned. Up close, she seemed even more ordinary. No makeup, hair slightly windblown, a canvas tote over one shoulder. And yet, there was something deeply composed about her. Solid. Steady. "Yes," she said softly. "You were with my son. At the park. And now here." She tilted her head slightly. "I didn't mean to intrude." "You're not a therapist?" he asked, cautious. She shook her head. "No." "You know him?" "No." He frowned. "Then why?" "I'm Emily," she said, extending a hand. He took it, briefly. "Daniel." "That's Max." She looked in the boy's direction, offered a small wave. Max was clutching his pillow and looking away again, retreating back into his shell. "I'm a teacher," Emily said. "Moved here last month. I work at Forest Hill Elementary. Special education." Daniel raised an eyebrow. She must have sensed the weight behind the silence, because she smiled, but not in a way that felt performative. More like someone who knew exactly what assumptions were being made. "I didn't approach him because I'm a teacher," she said. "I approached him because I recognized something." "In him?" Daniel asked. "In the silence," she replied. There it was again, that unshakable calm. That way she said so little but left so much unsaid. Daniel didn't quite know what to do with her. He had spent years deflecting well-meaning strangers. Years filtering every word about Max through clinical lenses, progress charts, measurable outcomes. And here was a woman who had offered no credentials, no solutions, only silence and a half-eaten cookie. "What do you think is wrong with him?" Daniel asked abruptly. Emily blinked. "Wrong." He nodded. "Most people have a theory. Genetics. Trauma. Brain chemistry. I've heard them all." She paused. "I don't think he's wrong, Mr. Stone," she said. "I don't even think he's hard to reach." "No. I think he's waiting." Daniel folded his arms. "Waiting for what?" "For someone who doesn't try to fix him." The words settled like dust in the air. Daniel didn't reply. He felt the urge to retreat, to end the conversation before it chipped further into the walls he had so carefully built. Emily seemed to sense this. "I'm not here for anything," she added quietly. "I didn't even know who you were until 5 minutes ago." That, more than anything, caught him off guard. "No offense," she said, almost apologetically, "but I've been kind of unplugged the last year." Daniel offered a short, breathless chuckle. It was the first real expression that had cracked his face all week. "Not many people say that to me," he admitted. "Well," she said, "you and Max don't strike me as the kind of people who need anything more added to their plates right now." He looked at her again. Not through the lens of suspicion or calculation, but consideration. Emily picked up her tote bag and gave a small nod. "Thanks for the chat." And then she left. Daniel stood there, caught between admiration and apprehension. He had spent his life reading people, evaluating motivations, drawing conclusions. And yet with her, with Emily, there was nothing to decode. She was either the most unassuming person he'd ever met, or the most dangerous. Either way, she had gotten through to Max in a way no one else ever had. And that scared him more than he cared to admit. It happened exactly 1 week later. Emily hadn't planned on running into them again. In fact, she had actively tried to avoid it, not out of shame or discomfort, but because something about that last conversation lingered. There was a tension in Daniel Stone that hadn't settled, a skepticism in his voice that made her feel like she had touched something fragile without permission. So when she walked into the small independent bookstore on Maple and 3rd that Saturday afternoon, she didn't expect anything more than to browse for a few quiet minutes before heading back to her apartment. Her week had been long parent-teacher meetings, budget talks, and a few tough behavioral days in her special ed class. She needed the calm of books, the scent of old pages and fresh coffee from the in-store cafe. She was 3 aisles in when she saw him. Max. He was sitting on the carpeted floor of the children's section, his legs crossed beneath him, a pillow tucked under one arm as always. His other hand was lightly touching the edge of a book, not turning the pages yet, just grazing the cover as if deciding whether or not the world inside was worth visiting. Daniel wasn't immediately visible. Perhaps he was browsing elsewhere, letting Max explore on his own from a short distance. Whatever the case, Emily froze. Her first instinct was to leave. But then she noticed something. Max looked different today. His posture was looser. His shoulders, usually drawn in like he was shielding himself from the world, were more relaxed. He seemed open. Not entirely, not dramatically, but enough that it made her pause. She stepped carefully around the display and picked up a nearby book, a slim graphic novel with bright, expressive illustrations. It was one she used in her classroom, a favorite among her students who struggled with attention and language. It had no dialogue, just pictures, full of emotion and small victories. She didn't approach him. Instead, she stood several feet away and slowly held the book up, just enough for Max to see. Not forcing it. Not expecting anything. Then gently, she placed it on the table beside him and stepped back. Max's eyes moved. First to the book. Then to her. There was no fear in his expression. Just quiet recognition. He reached for it. He opened to the first page, then the next, flipping not in haste, but with curiosity. After a few moments he stood, walked to the table where the book rested, and sat down. Emily didn't join him. She remained a respectful distance away, watching, her arms crossed loosely over her chest. This wasn't a breakthrough. It wasn't a therapy session. It was just something human. She didn't notice the man with the phone. He was 2 aisles over, partially hidden by a rotating display of cookbooks. A local blogger, self-proclaimed community voice, with a nose for anything that smelled remotely newsworthy. He didn't recognize Emily, but he certainly recognized Daniel Stone, who returned just minutes later holding a hardcover book in one hand and a coffee in the other. The timing was impeccable. The moment Daniel turned the corner and saw Max at the table, seated calmly beside the woman he had met just days ago, something in him shifted. It wasn't rage, not yet. It was confusion that burned hot in his chest because he didn't remember making an arrangement, and yet here she was again. With his son. Emily looked up as Daniel approached. She sensed the difference immediately. "Hey," she said softly. "What are you doing here?" Daniel asked. His tone wasn't aggressive, but it carried weight. Emily straightened. "Same as you, I imagine. Just looking for books." "With Max?" She frowned. "No. I didn't even know he was here. I just saw him and You picked out a book and waited." "I didn't wait. I stepped back." Daniel looked at his son. Max hadn't reacted yet, still flipping through pages, still absorbed. But Daniel's heart was pounding now. Not out of anger, but fear. Because this was happening again, and he didn't know how to make sense of it. Before Emily could say more, the man with the phone stepped forward. "Mr. Stone," he asked. "Do you mind if I ask, are you working with this woman? Is she part of a new support team?" Daniel blinked. "What?" "I run the neighborhood wire. I noticed your son seemed to really respond to her. I thought maybe you'd hired a specialist." Emily stiffened. I'm not. I don't have any comment, Daniel said quickly, his voice hardening. We're just shopping. The man nodded and backed away, but the damage had already been done. Emily looked at Daniel. You think I staged this? He didn't answer. You think I'm following you? That I want something from you. Daniel clenched his jaw. It's starting to look like a pattern. Emily exhaled. That's not fair. Isn't it? I've never asked you for anything. I've never approached Max without respect. You've been alone with him twice. Without my permission. Because he let me. Because you know what you're doing, Daniel interrupted. Don't pretend this is some accident. Emily's face tightened. Not with guilt, but hurt. She nodded once. Okay. Daniel said nothing more. He turned, called softly to Max, and walked away, his son trailing a few paces behind, hugging the pillow tighter than before. Emily remained still. She knew it wasn't fair. She also knew it didn't matter. Because in Daniel's world, a world of controlled environments and filtered trust, even the smallest variable could feel like betrayal. She left the bookstore a few minutes later, the book she had picked up still resting on the table. The blog post went up that night. A short video, grainy but clear, Max and Emily sitting at the table. No sound, just a caption. Is billionaire tech mogul using a secret specialist for his son? The clip spread quickly. Not viral, but enough to reach Daniel's PR team, who called him the next morning in a panic. By noon, Emily's name was trending in local forums. By evening, Daniel had cut all contact. No calls. No messages. Nothing. The door that had just begun to crack open slammed shut. The fallout came swiftly, but Daniel Stone was used to crisis control. His public relations team was among the best in the business. Trained to respond to rumor, redirect narratives, extinguish sparks before they became wildfires. Within hours of the video surfacing, they were already working behind the scenes, reaching out to the blogger, examining metadata, triangulating timestamps and camera angles. By the third day, their findings were clear. The footage had been taken by a customer at the bookstore, not affiliated in any way with Emily Parker. There was no evidence of coordination, no hidden agenda. No signs that Emily had ever attempted to contact Daniel before their initial encounter at the park. Her name didn't appear in any fan threads, social media mentions, or public interactions related to Daniel or his company. She had no history of seeking attention. In fact, she had no social media presence at all. When his team briefed him, Daniel sat in silence. He tapped his fingers on the edge of his desk, slowly, rhythmically, his mind not on the report, but on Max. The last few days had been difficult. Max had changed. It wasn't obvious to anyone else. To the therapists, the house staff, the carefully vetted caretakers, he was still quiet, still withdrawn, still nonverbal. But Daniel saw it. He felt it. It started with the pillow. Max had always carried it everywhere, but now, he gripped it tighter. Pressed it to his face while rocking in a slow, anxious rhythm. At night, he refused to sleep in his room. He would crawl into the hallway, curling against the wall until Daniel lifted him and carried him back to bed. And then the tears started. Not tantrums. Not outbursts. Just crying. Silent, strange, and deeply unsettling. At first, Daniel assumed it was a delayed response to stimulation, a phase. But then Max began refusing to leave the house. He would sit by the front door, sometimes for an hour, sometimes more, staring out as if waiting for someone. One morning he placed the pillow by the window, climbed onto the bench beside it, and sat, unmoving, for 3 hours. Daniel watched him from the hallway. The boy's eyes didn't drift toward the sky or the trees. They fixed on the sidewalk. On the empty space where someone used to stand. He's waiting. The thought came uninvited, quiet but unrelenting. He's not reacting to the world like usual. He's reacting to the absence of something specific. Someone specific. And in that moment, Daniel knew. It wasn't a regression. It wasn't overstimulation. It wasn't exhaustion. It was grief. His son was grieving someone who had never claimed to be anything, who had never tried to save him, never asked for a title, a paycheck, or recognition. Someone who simply knelt beside him once and offered half a cookie without a word. Emily. Daniel's chest tightened as he remembered the last time they spoke, the edge in his voice, the accusation in his tone. You know what you're doing. Don't pretend this is some accident. He had lashed out not because he believed she was dangerous, but because she had accessed something in Max he hadn't been able to reach. And that scared him. But now, as he watched his son quietly fall apart without her presence, that fear turned inward. What if I cut off the only connection he's ever made? He tried to reason it away. Tell himself it had been prudent to act cautiously. That any parent would have done the same. That trust, once broken, especially for someone with his history, couldn't be given freely. But none of that explained the change in Max. The quiet had deepened. The spark that had flickered just barely a week ago, in the park at the library, had faded again. And Max wasn't just silent now. He was distant. Detached. Hurt. Daniel stood up from his desk and walked to the living room, where Max sat curled under a knit blanket. The television played softly in the background, an old cartoon Max never actually watched but seemed to tolerate as white noise. Daniel lowered himself slowly to the floor beside him. "Hey buddy," he said gently. Max didn't respond. Not with sound, not with a glance. Daniel reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before resting lightly on Max's back. He waited. Still nothing. He felt helpless. And he hated it. Because for all the power he held in the world, the decisions that shifted markets, the companies that lived or died at his word, none of it meant anything here. Not in this room. Not to this boy. Especially not now. Daniel exhaled deeply and whispered something he hadn't said in years. "I'm sorry." He wasn't sure who it was for, Max, Emily, or himself. But the words settled in the room like an apology long overdue. Later that evening, he returned to his office. He pulled up the report again, scanning the names, the timelines, the transcripts. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. Emily Parker was not chasing anything. She had shown up, not out of ambition or design, but out of instinct. And that instinct had touched Max in a way nothing else ever had. Daniel closed the file, sat back in his chair, and stared at the ceiling. He thought of Emily's words. "I don't think he's hard to reach. I think he's waiting." Max was still waiting. But this time for her. Daniel didn't know if it was too late. If the damage had been done. If Emily would even take his call. But he knew one thing with complete certainty. His son was missing her. Not a doctor. Not a specialist. Not a miracle worker. Just the woman who had knelt beside him in silence. And never asked for anything in return. The elementary school stood quietly at the edge of town, a low brick building with faded blue trim and a playground worn soft by time. There was nothing remarkable about it from the outside. Just another public school where tiny shoes squeaked down long hallways and drawings were taped proudly to classroom doors. But for Daniel Stone, it might as well have been a cathedral. He hadn't told anyone he was going, not his assistant, not his driver, not even the PR team who meticulously tracked his calendar. He just got in the car and drove, one hand on the wheel, the other holding a book. It was the same graphic novel Max had flipped through in the bookstore. The same one Emily had wordlessly placed near him, then stepped away from. That day had lived in Daniel's mind ever since, not for what was said, but for what wasn't. For how Emily had known when to move close and when to stay back. For how she'd offered no strategy, no system. Just presence. Just understanding. He entered the school slowly, checking in at the front office with a nod, politely declining an escort. He remembered the room number from the report. He didn't need directions. The halls smelled faintly of glue and crayons. Soft music drifted from an open door down the corridor. And then he saw it, a hand-painted sign above the frame, Room 14, Special Explorers. He paused outside, straightened his jacket, and knocked once. Inside, Emily was seated cross-legged on a colorful rug, surrounded by 5 children, each uniquely absorbed in their own world. Some hummed. One rocked gently. Another tapped 2 blocks together rhythmically. And Emily, she was just there. Listening. Holding the space without demanding attention. When she looked up and saw him, her expression didn't shift in surprise. No panic, no discomfort. Just a quiet awareness. She rose slowly, offered a gesture to a fellow aide to take over, and stepped into the hallway, pulling the door closed behind her. Daniel held up the book in his hand. "I believe this belongs to you," he said. Emily didn't reach for it. She waited. He glanced at the cover, then back at her. "I used to think the most important thing in life was knowing what to say. That the right words, delivered at the right time, could build companies, move markets, change lives." He took a breath. "But you taught me something else." Emily's eyes searched his, still silent. Daniel's voice softened. "You taught me that sometimes, the only thing that matters is sitting down quietly and waiting with someone, without expecting anything in return." She blinked, but said nothing. And then Daniel added, almost as if confessing, "I didn't know how to do that. Not with him. Not with anyone." For a moment, they stood in silence. Not awkward, but full. Honest. Finally, Emily nodded. A small, almost imperceptible gesture. But somehow, it felt larger than any speech. And then, footsteps echoed down the hallway. Daniel turned just in time to see Max. He had been waiting outside the office, clutching his pillow, his eyes scanning the corridor. The moment he spotted her, the pillow dropped. His feet moved before his mind could catch up. He ran. Not fast, not wild, but with purpose. With clarity. Straight to Emily. And for the first time in his young life, Max did something he had never done with anyone outside his father. He opened his arms and embraced her. No prompting. No cue. No reward. Just the trust of a boy who had finally found a place to land. Emily knelt to meet him, arms wrapping gently around his small shoulders. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She simply held him, the way only someone who had waited long enough knew how. Daniel watched, unmoving. His heart cracked open in a way it hadn't in years. Not from sadness. From recognition. Max hadn't just connected with someone. He had chosen her. And somehow that choice, quiet, unannounced, unspectacular to anyone outside this hallway, felt like the most significant thing Daniel had ever witnessed. If you believe that some strangers don't come into our lives to change the world, but simply to help one quiet child find their voice again, please leave a like on this video. And don't forget to subscribe to help us share more true, human stories just like this one. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. We'll see you next time.